Apple went totally all out this year with the iPad Air 5 because they gave it the M1 chip. Yes, the same chip that comes in the more expensive iPad Pro. So with that said, you'd think that it's a much better buy. Save 200 bucks, get the same M1, why not? Well, that's what we're gonna figure out in this video, including testing things like the speakers, the cameras, the displays, the display performance and reflectivity, and a bunch of other stuff that we're gonna be talking about in this video. So let's go ahead and get into the design comparison first. Now, the first thing I wanna start off with is comparing the back sides, and a very interesting detail that Apple added this year is the iPad Air text, whereas it used to always just say iPad, like you can see here on the 11-inch iPad Pro, just says iPad. Now, the biggest difference that we can notice is actually the camera modules. On the new iPad Air 5, you still get the same 12 megapixel rear camera, but on the iPad Pro, you get this nice square bump that has an additional ultra-wide 12 megapixel camera as well, and you get a flash, which for some reason, Apple didn't add a flash to the iPad Air. I have no idea why. And then of course you have the little microphone cutout. Now, this is actually a big deal to me because if you're using the Magic Keyboard case, the iPad Pro's square bump fits it perfectly, but of course on the iPad Air, when you hook it up to that case, you have the little gap there and it doesn't look as clean, but that's not that big of a deal. And now moving over to the top side, we see a couple of differences. First of all, the speaker cutouts on the iPad Pro are a little bit smaller, and I think it does have less holes. Now, this is actually an interesting difference because when you're holding it in your hand like this, you tend to block less of the speaker cutouts, which is nice in terms of sound quality. And a big difference here I want to mention is that they also have speaker grills on the bottom, but there is a very big difference in terms of the speakers because the iPad Pro actually has 4 of them, so that's quad stereo compared to only 2, one on each side on the iPad Air. So half of these speaker grills are actually fake. And then another big difference on the top is actually in terms of the power button because the iPad Pro has a regular basic power button, but the iPad Air 5 has the same Touch ID power button from last year, or at least the last iPad Air 4. And this is actually a big deal because the iPad Pro comes with Face ID, which I personally love and I think is just so much better than Touch ID on the iPad Air because sometimes it doesn't work and it just doesn't authenticate, and you obviously have to reach up, touch it, which could be annoying, especially if it's on the Magic Keyboard case compared to the iPad Pro. You simply tap the spacebar and it unlocks. And now the last thing I want to talk about before we move on to the displays and comparing other things like the speakers is the USB Type-C ports. Now, of course, they both have the M1 chip, so you'd think they can both support Thunderbolt. However, Apple gave the iPad Air 5 a USB Type-C port. It is twice as fast as the last one, so it's 10 gigabits per second, but the iPad Pro actually supports Thunderbolt, so it supports speeds up to 40 gigabits per second. So in just a minute, I'm actually gonna connect an SSD and test out the transfer speeds, but before we get into that, let's actually get into the displays right here. Now on the front, everything looks extremely similar, except of course you could see those black Face ID sensors up at the top on the iPad Pro, but one major difference that I am noticing is actually the display bezels. Yes, the bezels on the iPad Pro do look slimmer, and this is a difference that you can notice day to day. It's a subtle difference, but it is definitely there. And before I jump into comparing the actual display quality, I want to pivot over to the speaker comparison test. So let's see which one has the better speakers. Holy moly, guys, that is a absolutely massive difference. First of all, the volume difference is huge. The iPad Pro is just so much louder, but just everything. The bass is tighter, it's deeper. The overall soundstage is wider. You can hear the separation of frequencies from the different speakers. The little tiny tunes are just brought up and they're brought out, whereas they're kind of muted on the iPad Air. and the vocals are just so rich and clear. Compared to the iPad Air, it just sounds weak in comparison to the iPad Pro. Just listen to this. That's nuts. Yeah, the speakers on the iPad Pro, by far, much better. And I know there's a $200 difference between the iPad Air and the iPad Pro. That's $600 compared to $800. But right now on Amazon, you can buy this for $750 brand new on sale. So only $150 difference. And man, I care about the speakers a lot. And this by itself, I don't know, might be enough to make that decision. As you guys can see, the iPad Air 5 has the new ultra-wide selfie camera, which does support center stage. And the difference between the microphones is the iPad Pro actually has studio quality microphones, and it has 5 of them compared to just 2. So hopefully you guys can hear a microphone difference. So let me switch over to the iPad Pro. Here I am on the iPad Pro. Let me know if there is in fact a microphone quality difference or not, because there should be, because Apple advertises it. So yeah, also let me know if you see any difference in the ultra-wide cameras. There honestly should not be, but there might. And now before we move on to comparing the display quality, the brightness, the HDR video, and things like that, I do want to test out the storage speed and the new USB-C connector. So I have Jazz Geekbench right here. Let's go ahead and run the test. First of all, it appears that the iPad Air 5 is actually slightly faster, 1741 megabytes per second compared to 1391 for the read, and then 2169 compared to 2031. Now that might be just a margin of error difference, but if we go down to the random 4K read and write, it looks like the read on the iPad Air is faster, but then it's swapped over for the iPad Pro, but I think they should be around the same, so no major differences. Now I grabbed an SSD. This is actually a Thunderbolt SSD from Sabrent, and this supports both USB-C and Thunderbolt at the same time. So let's go ahead and compare the difference in transfer speeds. All right, so I connected the SSD and I'm trying to find a big file. Here's actually WWDC from last year. I'm gonna try to go ahead and throw it onto my iPad, and I have a stopwatch right here to see how long it takes. Oh, that was done. 3 seconds. So the iPad Pro with Thunderbolt took only 3 seconds to transfer that. Now let's go ahead and test it on the iPad Air. And now over on the iPad Air, let's test it out. Huh, not that big of a difference, honestly, for that file. 3.88 seconds, so slightly longer on the iPad Air 5. Now this is actually quite weird because the iPad Pro should be much faster in terms of transfer speeds. It should be 4 times, up to 4 times as fast. So what I did is I grabbed an actual Thunderbolt SSD and I'm gonna transfer 2 larger files just to make sure that we're having a Thunderbolt connection, because this supports both. So maybe there could be some kind of issue where it's choosing USB-C instead of Thunderbolt. So let's transfer another file. So I've been trying to get these 2 SSDs to connect, but iPadOS has this weird issue with drives connecting and they just don't show up in the Files app. Apple, please fix this, because this is annoying and I just can't run this test because of it. So let's move on to the next one. And now moving on to the display quality, the first thing I want to mention is the difference in display brightness. So as you can see right here, the iPad Pro is a little bit brighter than the iPad Air because it has 600 nits compared to 500. So that is a nice difference for when you're in a bright room or potentially outside. But my absolute favorite difference is the fact that the iPad Pro comes with 120 Hertz ProMotion display technology. So it allows the refresh rate to ramp from 24 Hertz up to 120. So when you're swiping and scrolling, reading, looking through apps, swiping through Twitter, everything is incredibly sharp and smooth. There's no motion blur. Everything's just buttery smooth compared to the iPad Air that has a solid 60 Hertz display and it just looks choppy, and I just can't stand it because I actually have the iPhone 13 Pro Max, and this also has 120 Hertz ProMotion, and when you get used to this, it becomes so hard to go back to a 60 Hertz iPad. And another benefit for the iPad Pro with ProMotion is actually battery life, because if you're watching a video that's filmed at 24 or 30 FPS like on YouTube, you are going to be saving battery life compared to the iPad Air, which is always at 60 Hz. And then on top of that, if you are an artist and you use the Apple Pencil, the ProMotion tech actually helps reduce the latency and make it feel much more smooth and natural on the iPad Pro compared to the iPad Air. Now, in terms of actually watching videos, both of them have extremely similar video display quality, but the iPad Pro does get a little bit brighter. So honestly, they both look absolutely incredible. These displays look really, really good. And now with the displays out of the way, let's finally get into the performance testing. And as you can see, I have Geekbench 5 open right here, and they both have 8 GB of RAM. However, with the iPad Pro, if you up the storage to 1 TB or higher, you actually get double. You get 16 gigs of RAM, and that's the only way to get that on an iPad with the iPad Pro, whereas the iPad Air is just stuck to the same 8 gigs. And another big difference is that it comes with only 64 gigs of storage compared to 128 on the iPad Pro for the base price. So if you were to actually try to get more storage on the iPad Air, you're forced to go to 256 gigs, which costs $750, which is exactly how much you can buy an iPad Pro for right now on Amazon on sale using the link in the description. So let's go ahead and run the CPU benchmark. And there you go, no surprises. They both have the M1 chip, so they're both almost identical in terms of the CPU performance. But let me actually test the graphics to see if Apple did apply some sort of limit to the iPad Air by surprise. And there you go, just as expected, basically the same performance between the two. So that definitely sounds great for the iPad Air, but I do want to point out a very big difference that kind of makes it hard to recommend the iPad Air over the iPad Pro. Well, because of the 120Hz ProMotion support on the iPad Pro, there are a lot of games on the iOS App Store which support 120 FPS gaming mode. So you could actually take advantage of the M1 chip and get crazy good frame rates, and you could be a lot more competitive in games like Pokemon Unite, Call of Duty, Genshin Impact, for example. But on the iPad Air, you have all of that performance that you just can't take advantage of because you're limited by the 60 Hz display. So even though it gets the M1, I'm just so disappointed that it's limited to 60 Hz. So with all of that testing and comparing out of the way, let's finally get into the main conclusion, and we're gonna answer the question of, is it worth just buying the iPad Air and saving some money, $150 to $200, over just going for the more expensive iPad Pro? And the way I'm gonna conclude this is by mentioning 3 main differences between the two. The first thing is, of course, the USB-C port, where we actually have Thunderbolt on the iPad Pro. Now, this is actually gonna be a big deal for all the people out there who care about Thunderbolt and have a lot of Thunderbolt accessories and who use their iPad for professional use cases like video or photo editing. That's gonna be nice. But for the common man, this new USB Type-C port with up to 10 gigabits per second is honestly fast enough, so that's not going to be that big of a game changer. Now, the second thing is actually the speakers. And if you really care about speakers, the ones on the iPad Pro are quite a bit better, and I really do. So this is a big deal for me, but maybe not a lot of people care about that. So the third thing is the 120Hz ProMotion tech on the iPad Pro, and I would honestly say that this by itself is worth the extra $150 to $200 for the iPad Pro, because it makes it feel like it's a lot snappier and it's just buttery smooth scrolling through everything. Especially using the Apple Pencil, you have lowered latency, and especially for anybody who cares about gaming, that is going to be a very big deal, and it's a really huge deal to me because I also have 120Hz ProMotion on my iPhone. So whenever I use the iPad Air with a 60 Hz display, it just looks and feels choppy, and that bugs me. So with all of that said, yes, the people who don't really care about those things can definitely save the money, go for the iPad Air. But if you care about any of those 3 things that I mentioned, go for the iPad Pro. So there you guys go. Hopefully you enjoyed this hands-on comparison, and if you did, go ahead and click the subscribe button up above to subscribe and help us reach 1 million subs by the end of the next few months. Hopefully, definitely check out one of those 2 videos right over there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.